Welcome back to Night Terror. Put on your headphones, take a deep breath. Let's see how much your mind can handle before the sun comes up. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there.
The radio cut out at exactly 2:14 in the morning, and that was the first thing I should have paid attention to, because it didn't fade, it didn't crackle. It just stopped mid-word like someone had pressed a button somewhere, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that my hands tightened on the steering wheel before I even understood why. I was on Route 9 heading back from my brother's place in Millhaven, a drive I had done maybe 40 or 50 times over the years, a long flat stretch of two-lane highway that cuts through a part of the state where there isn't much of anything for miles in either direction, just fields and tree lines and the occasional grain silo standing dark against whatever sky exists out there beyond your headlights. I knew that road well enough that I usually did the drive almost on autopilot, which is maybe why, when things started to feel wrong, it took me a while to put my finger on exactly what I was seeing. The radio stayed silent for about 30 seconds and then came back on its own, picking up in the middle of a different song than the one that had been playing, which I told myself was just a signal thing, just the terrain playing with the antenna the way it sometimes does out there. And I turned the volume up a little and settled back in my seat and watched the yellow center line disappear under my hood in that hypnotic rhythm that long night drives always produce. It was cold outside early November, and the heater was working hard enough that the windows had started to fog slightly at the edges. So I cracked the driver's side window just enough to let some air in, and the cold came through sharp and clean and smelling like frost and dead leaves and something else underneath it that I couldn't identify at the time, but that I would think about later. A lot. I had the cruise control set at 62, which was my habit on that road. Just a few over the limit, but nothing that would attract attention, and I was maybe 40 minutes from home when I passed the first one. I almost didn't register it as anything because it happened fast, and the edge of my headlights only caught it for a second. But there was a figure standing about 8 or 10 feet off the road on the right shoulder, completely still, facing away from traffic, just standing there in the dark in what looked like a dark jacket or coat, and because I was doing 62, it was gone before I could look twice. I told myself it was someone who had pulled over, maybe car trouble, maybe someone who needed to walk off into the field for a minute, the way men sometimes do when there are no rest stops for miles. I told myself that, and I kept driving. The radio cut out again at 2:19. I noticed the time because I had just glanced at the clock on the dash, and this time the silence lasted longer, maybe 2 full minutes, and during those 2 minutes I became very aware of all the sounds that my car makes when there is no music covering them. The low hum of the engine, the slight vibration of the tires on the road surface, the whisper of wind coming through the cracked window, and underneath all of that, something that I can only describe as a pressure, like the air itself had gotten heavier. The radio came back at 2:21, playing what sounded like a talk radio station I didn't recognize, a voice speaking in a very calm and measured tone about weather patterns, and I switched it back to the FM station I'd had on before and tried to stop paying attention to things that probably had explanations. 3 miles further on, I passed the second figure. Same position, right shoulder, facing away from the road, completely still, but this one was closer to the road than the first, maybe 4 or 5 feet from the white line, close enough that my headlights hit the back of them clearly enough for me to see that they weren't moving at all, not shifting weight, not turning to look as I passed, which people almost always do when a car goes by close to them at night. It's instinct. You turn toward the light, but this person didn't. Dark jacket, dark pants. Couldn't see the hands, couldn't see the face because the face was pointed away from me. And then I was past them and there was just road again and my own breathing, which had gotten slightly faster without me noticing. I turned on my hazard lights for a second, thinking I would pull over and see if someone needed help. And then I turned them back off and kept going, because something that I cannot fully explain made me not want to stop. It wasn't a conscious decision exactly. It was more like the part of your brain that sits below the thinking part had already made up its mind, and the rest of me was just following along. And that part of my brain was saying, keep moving. And so I kept moving, and I watched my mirrors for a long time after that, But the figure never moved, just stayed there in the red wash of my taillights until the road curved slightly and they disappeared. I called my girlfriend. Her phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which made sense because it was after 2 in the morning and she was asleep. And I left a message that I later listened back to, and I sounded completely normal, which surprised me, because by the time I left that message, I was not feeling completely normal. I said I was almost home. I said the drive was fine. I said I'd see her in the morning, and I hung up and tried to think rationally about what I had seen, which was 2 people standing by the side of the road at 2 in the morning doing nothing. And while that was strange, it was not impossible. There were explanations. There were always explanations. The third figure was at 2:31 according to the clock, and this one I nearly stopped for because it was standing directly on the white fog line at the edge of the road, close enough that if my car had drifted even slightly to the right, I would have had to swerve. And as I passed this one, I had a full second of clear headlight illumination. And I can tell you with certainty that it was a person in dark clothing facing away from the road. And I can tell you that in that one full second, they did not move, did not flinch, did not do anything to acknowledge a car passing within 3 feet of them at highway speed. And the stillness was the wrong kind of stillness, the kind that doesn't belong to a living thing. And that thought arrived in my head fully formed, and I immediately tried to push it away because it was not the kind of thought I wanted to be having alone on a dark road at 2:30 in the morning. I pressed the accelerator down, and the cruise control disengaged, and I was doing 75 before I realized I had sped up, and I kept it there for a while because distance felt important. Distance felt like something I needed, and the radio was playing normally now, and I turned it up loud enough to fill the car, and I kept both hands on the wheel, and I watched the road ahead of me, and I tried to stop thinking about the way those figures had been spaced, which was roughly 3 miles apart each time, which was a pattern. And patterns are the thing your brain reaches for when it's trying to find a way to make something frightening feel manageable, because if there's a pattern, then maybe there's also a rule. And if there's a rule, then maybe you can figure out what you need to do. I had been driving for about 4 minutes at that speed when I saw the car. It was pulled over on the left shoulder, which is unusual in itself because you don't normally pull over on the left unless you've had some kind of emergency. And it had its hazard lights going, orange pulse, orange pulse, orange pulse in the dark. And as I went by, I could see through the window that there was someone in the driver's seat. And I slowed down slightly because I was already in the passing gear, and slowing felt safer than continuing at that speed past a stopped car. And as I slowed, I could see that the person in the driver's seat was sitting very straight, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. And they were not moving. The car was running. I could see exhaust coming from the tailpipe in the cold air. And the hazard lights were going, and the person inside was sitting perfectly still at the wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing, and I was past them in 3 seconds and back up to speed in 4. And I did not look in my mirror for a long time because I didn't want to see whether they were still sitting there or whether something else was happening. I called my brother. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he hadn't been asleep, and I said, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm almost home." And he said, "Okay, good." And then he said, "You sound weird." And I said, "I'm fine, just tired." And he said, "Okay, but you sound weird." And I said, "I passed some people standing on the side of the road." And there was a pause, and he said, "What do you mean standing?" And I said, "Just standing there." And he said, "Like hitchhikers." And I said, "No, not like hitchhikers. They weren't facing the road. They were facing away from the road." And there was another pause, and my brother said, "How many?" And I said, 3. And he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Stay on the phone with me." And I said, "Okay," and we stayed on the phone. And he asked me about the landmarks I was passing so he could track approximately where I was. And I told him I had just gone through the blinking light intersection at County 7, which meant I was about 22 minutes from home. And he said, "Okay, good, keep talking." I don't know if my brother knows something about that road that I don't. He grew up in Millhaven. He's lived there his whole life. And when I asked him later why he'd wanted me to stay on the phone, he said he just didn't like the idea of me driving alone after hearing that. And maybe that's true. Maybe it was just a brotherly instinct, but there was something in his voice when I described the figures that I have thought about a lot since, a kind of recognition that he didn't put into words, a stillness in the way he was listening that reminded me uncomfortably of something. We were talking about his son's school play, making normal conversation, and I was watching the road and watching the shoulders on both sides, and the radio was still playing and everything was quiet. And then at 2:44, I saw something that made me stop talking mid-sentence. And my brother said, "Hello, you still there?" And I said, "Yeah, sorry." And he said, "What happened?" And I said, "I think I just passed another one." And he said, "Another person." And I said, "Yes." But this time they were on the left side. And my brother said the left side. And I said, "Yes, facing away from the road on the left shoulder." And my brother said, "Okay, keep driving." And I said, I am driving. I want to try to explain what it was about these figures that was so disturbing, because I'm aware that standing by the side of a road is not inherently frightening. People have reasons to be near roads. Cars break down. People walk places. All of that is true. But there is a way that a human body holds itself when it is at rest that tells you something is in there. Some living thing making continuous micro-adjustments to balance, shifting slightly, breathing, alive, and these figures had none of that. They had the stillness of objects. They had the stillness of things that had been placed there, and that was the word my brain kept returning to, placed, as if they had been positioned on the shoulder of Route 9 the way you might position something on a shelf deliberately with intent, and then left there to serve some purpose I didn't understand. My brother kept talking and I kept answering, and the miles went by and the road was dark and I was checking my mirrors constantly now, checking both shoulders, and the figure on the left at 2:44 had been the fourth one, which meant they were still roughly 3 miles apart, but now they were alternating sides, right, 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 left, and I was trying not to think about what that pattern might mean, trying not to construct the next step in a sequence I didn't want to understand, but my brain was already doing the math on its own, and coming up with answers I didn't like. I came up over a small rise in the road, and my headlights swept across the valley below, and I could see the road stretching out ahead of me for maybe half a mile before it curved, and in that half mile I could count. I could actually count from that elevated angle, 3 separate figures standing on the shoulders of the road ahead of me, and they were alternating, left, right, left, standing at intervals that looked even from up here, metronomic. 3 miles becoming 2 miles, becoming something I couldn't calculate, getting closer together as I got further down the road. And I think I made a sound when I saw that, not quite a word, just a sound, and my brother said, "What is it?" And I told him what I was seeing, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, listen to me. Don't slow down, don't stop. Just keep driving and stay on the phone." And I said, "Okay," and I started down the hill. The first of the 3 was on the left, and I went past at 80 miles an hour and had maybe half a second of illumination, and it looked the same as the others, dark clothing, facing away, perfectly still, and then it was behind me, and the second was on the right, and I went past that one too, and the third was, and coming up on the left, and as I approached it I had a longer look than I'd had at any of the others, because the road was straighter here, and my headlights reached it a little sooner. And this figure was standing about 3 feet from the fog line, and it was facing away from me, and then, as my headlights hit it, and as I came within maybe 100 feet of it, it slowly, very slowly, began to turn. I was past it before it completed the turn. I never saw the face. I don't know if that's better or worse, and I have spent a lot of time since that night not being able to decide. I went past at 80 and I watched my mirrors, and in my tail lights the figure had completed its turn and was facing the road now, facing the direction I had come from, facing away from me now the way all the others had been facing me. And I understand that looking at it from behind means it's facing toward you. I understand the geometry of that, but there was something about seeing the last one turn and then face the same direction as all the others that made my body feel like all the warmth had gone out of it all at once. My brother was saying my name. I answered him. I told him what I had seen or tried to tell him. And he said, "How far are you from the junction?" And I said, "Maybe 12 minutes. And he said, "Okay, just 12 more minutes. Just keep driving." And I said, "Are you going to tell me what you know about that road?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "You grew up there. You know that road." And he said, "I'll tell you when you get home." And I said, "Tell me now." And he said, "I'll tell you when you get home." He did not tell me when I got home. He said he would drive over the next day and we would talk then. And I said, "You can just tell me now over the phone." And he said, "It's late and you're home safe and just get some sleep." And I said, "All right." And I went inside and I locked the door and I sat on my couch for about an hour before I was calm enough to go to bed. He came over the next afternoon and he sat in my kitchen, and he told me that when he was 17, so about 20 years ago, there had been an incident on Route 9, not exactly in the section I had been driving, but nearby. And he didn't want to get into the details because they weren't relevant, but people in Millhaven had strange experiences on that road sometimes, especially at night, especially in fall and early winter, and that there wasn't a satisfying explanation for it, and most people just learned not to drive it alone after midnight. And I asked him why he hadn't told me that, and he said, "Because I never thought you'd have a problem, because most people don't, because it's not something that happens to everyone." And I said, "But it happened to me." And he said yes. He wouldn't say anything more than that. He said he didn't know more than that, and I'm not sure I believe him, but I'm also not sure it matters, because the experience itself happened, and that doesn't change, regardless of whether anyone can explain it. I drove Route 9 again about 3 weeks later in the daytime, because I needed to visit my brother, and I wasn't willing to go around yet, and the road looks completely ordinary in daylight, flat and unremarkable, fields on both sides, the kind of road you forget as soon as you've driven it. And I went slowly past the sections where the figures had been, and there was nothing there, of course, no marks, no indication, nothing to suggest anything had ever happened, and I don't know what I was looking for exactly. But here is the thing I haven't told anyone except my brother, and which I've thought about nearly every day since that night. When I got home and sat down on my couch and tried to decompress from the drive, I had my phone in my hand, and I opened it to call my girlfriend back to let her know I was home, and I had a notification I hadn't seen, a missed call, and the missed call was from a number I didn't recognize, a local number with a Millhaven area code, and the call had come in at 2:14 in the morning, which was exactly when my radio cut out the first time, and when I listened to the voicemail, there was nothing there, just about 30 seconds of what sounded like wind or road noise, like someone holding a phone out a car window at highway speed, and at the very end of it, so quiet I had to turn my volume all the way up and put the phone against my ear. There was something that might have been breathing, and might have been static, and might have been, I genuinely do not know, a voice saying a single word that I could not make out. I called the number back and it was disconnected. I looked it up and found nothing. I saved it in my contacts under a placeholder name, and about a week later the entry disappeared from my phone on its own, which I know sounds impossible, but which happened, and I know it happened because I checked for it. I've had 4 other experiences on night drives over the past 2 years that I've been trying to figure out how to talk about, each one different, each one with its own specific shape of wrongness, and Route 9 is only part of it. Only the beginning of something I started noticing once I started paying attention, which is maybe the real problem, maybe the thing I should be warning you about, which is that once you start seeing the patterns, they don't stop, they accumulate, they build on each other, and I'm not sure anymore whether that's because the patterns are everywhere and I'm only now noticing them, or whether noticing them is what made them begin. That first night I kept checking my mirrors for the whole 12 minutes between the last figure and the junction, and nothing followed me. There were no headlights. There was nothing back there that I could see. And I want that to be comforting. I want that to mean that whatever was on Route 9 stayed on Route 9. But what I know about patterns, what I have learned slowly over the past 2 years, is that the end of a pattern is not the same as the end of what made it. The figures on the road were not the point. The figures were the arrangement. Something was using them the way you might use markers to measure a distance, to establish a boundary, to mark something out, and what I was doing, unwittingly by driving through them, by passing each one in sequence, by watching the last one turn, was completing something, passing through all the points in an order. And I don't know what that accomplishes. I don't know what it means to have done that, but I don't think it means nothing. I still drive at night. I drive at night a lot, it's part of how I live, and I won't let this be the thing that changes that about me. Or I'm trying not to let it be that. But I will tell you that I pay attention differently now, that I watch shoulders, and I watch the distances between things, and that there have been nights on other roads in other parts of the state where I have noticed a stillness at the edge of my headlights that made my hands tighten on the wheel before my brain caught up with my body. And on those nights I keep driving. I keep my speed steady. I don't slow down and I don't stop, and I keep both hands on the wheel, and I watch the road ahead of me. And sometimes when I get home and I'm sitting in my driveway with the engine off in the silence that comes after a long drive, I have the feeling of something I can only describe as being noted, as if somewhere in the dark between here and wherever I came from, something made a mark, something recorded that I passed through, something that keeps a kind of account is aware of me. And I tell myself that's just the feeling, just the aftermath, just the way a frightened brain talks to itself in the quiet. And on most nights I can almost believe that. The second time something happened on a night drive, I was on a completely different road in a completely different county. And it was summer, which matters because I had started to tell myself that whatever had been on Route 9 was a cold weather thing, a November thing, a darkness and frost thing, and summer felt like armor against it. And I was wrong about that. I was driving back from a work thing, a conference that had gone long, and it was about 1:30 in the morning, and I was on a county highway that I also knew reasonably well, a road with gentle curves and a lot of tree cover that in the daytime is genuinely beautiful, the kind of road that would be relaxing to drive, and in the summer darkness it was warm enough that I had all my windows down and the air smelled like cut grass and creek water and the kind of thick green smell that midsummer nights have. I wasn't thinking about Route 9. I had managed over the 7 months since that November to do a reasonable job of not thinking about Route 9, or at least of not thinking about it every day, and I was listening to a podcast and feeling fine, and then I drove through a section of road where the trees close in on both sides and create a kind of tunnel effect, and I came out the other side of the tunnel and the podcast cut out. Not the radio this time. The podcast, which was on my phone through Bluetooth, and that particular thing doesn't happen to phones the way radio can get disrupted by terrain. And the silence was the same complete and sudden absence, and my hands did the same thing they had done on Route 9 7 months earlier. The podcast came back after about a minute, and I convinced myself it was a Bluetooth glitch, a phone thing, something technical, and I kept driving, and the road curved and straightened and curved again, and the road curved and straightened and curved again, and I came around a long bend, and my headlights picked up something in the road ahead of me, and I braked hard enough that the car behind me, which I hadn't known was there, had to brake too, and flashed their lights at me. What was in the road was a dog, or I thought it was a dog, a large dark shape sitting in the center of my lane, and I had slowed to about 20 before I got close enough to see that it wasn't a dog, it was a suitcase. A large dark suitcase sitting upright in the center of the road, fully zipped, handle up as if someone had set it down there and walked away. I stopped and sat there for a moment, and the car that had been behind me pulled around me without stopping and went on, and I was alone in the road with my headlights on this suitcase, and it just sat there being a suitcase in the middle of a county highway at 1:30 in the morning. And I want to be clear that I did not touch it. I did not get out of my car. I am not someone who gets out of their car on a dark road to approach an unknown object in the middle of the night. Not after Route 9, not anymore. And I pulled around it carefully and kept going. I watched it in my mirrors as I drove away, and it stayed where it was, handle up, just sitting there. And I told myself it had fallen off someone's car or truck. It had come loose from a roof rack or a hitch carrier. It had a normal explanation, and I believe that is probably true. What I could not stop thinking about as I drove away was the positioning of it, the fact that it was sitting upright in the center of the lane, handle extended. The way you would set a suitcase down if you were carrying it, not the way it would land if it had fallen from a vehicle, which would be on its side or its corner, and I know that's not proof of anything. I know there are ways a suitcase could land upright, and I told myself all of those things and kept driving. I reported it when I got home. I called the non-emergency line and said there was a suitcase in the road on County Highway F, around mile marker 14, and the dispatcher said, "Okay, thank you, we'll send someone to check on it." And I said, "Great, thank you," and hung up. I called back the next day to ask if they'd found anything, and they said the responding officer hadn't found any suitcase when they arrived, which could mean it had been moved by then, or hit by a car, or that I had described the location imprecisely, or several other things, and I accepted those explanations and tried to go about my life. But the podcast thing, the silence before the suitcase, that's the part that stayed with me, because it was the same sequence, audio cuts out, silence, something appears that shouldn't be there, And I've thought about whether I was pattern matching in an unhealthy way, whether 7 months of occasional Route 9 anxiety had primed me to see sequences where there weren't any, and I think that's possible. I think that might even be what was happening, but I also think about the fact that the second time something happened on a night drive, there was a silence first, the same silence, the same complete and sudden kind, and I don't know how to factor that out. The third experience was in October, almost a year after Route 9, and this one is the one I find hardest to talk about because it involves another person, a stranger, and I still don't fully understand what happened or what they wanted. I was driving home from a late dinner with friends, so I had only been away from home about 3 hours, and it was just after midnight, and I was on the interstate, which felt safe because the interstate is big and lit and there are other cars, and I had Route 9 rules in my head by then, even though I hadn't written them down. Keep moving, don't stop, watch the shoulders, note the patterns, and I was following those rules without consciously thinking about them. There was a woman at the side of the road, on-ramp, standing next to a car that had its hood up, and she was waving, flagging down traffic, which is normal, which is the normal thing to do when you're broken down. And I slowed because there were other cars around and it was an on-ramp and not a dark, empty road. And I told myself, my rules were for dark, empty roads and this was different. I pulled over about 50 feet ahead of her and put my hazards on, and she came up to my window and I lowered it 2 inches and asked if she was okay. She was in her maybe mid-40s, ordinary looking, dressed like someone who had come from a dinner or a work function, heels, blazer, and she said her car had died and her phone was dead and she had been trying to flag someone down for 45 minutes. I said I could call roadside assistance for her, and she said she didn't have roadside assistance, and I said I could call her a tow truck, and she said that would be great, but it would take a long time, and she was really scared, and could. I please just drive her to the next exit where there was a gas station. And I want to be clear that everything about this woman seemed completely real and completely distressed. And I am not someone who would normally hesitate to help a person in this situation, but I had my Route 9 rules running in the background of my head, and one of the rules was, don't stop. And I had stopped, and now I was deciding whether to let a stranger into my car. And I was doing that decision-making while something in the back of my head was taking note of the fact that her car's hood was up, but I hadn't actually looked at her car's position on the on-ramp, hadn't confirmed whether it was really dead or just idling, and I hadn't noticed until right then that there were no other cars on the interstate ahead of us, which on a major highway at midnight is unusual but not impossible. I called her a tow truck. I sat in my car and I called a towing service, while she stood outside my window and I told her someone would be there in 30 to 40 minutes, and I could wait with her if she wanted, meaning I would stay parked nearby with my hazards on. Not that she could get in my car, and she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, okay, thank you. She walked back toward her car and I watched in my mirrors, and the tow truck did eventually come. I waited and it came, and she got in the cab with the driver, and they left, and I got back on the interstate and drove home. I've gone back and forth on this one more than any other. The most likely explanation is that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a person who needed help, and I was helpful in the way I could be, and the slightly guarded way I was helpful is understandable given what I'd been through, and that's the end of it. But there are 2 things that I cannot fully resolve. The first is the expression she gave me when I said someone would come to her, but she couldn't get in my car. It wasn't frustration, which would be the natural response. It wasn't relief either, and it wasn't fear. And I have a good vocabulary for human facial expressions, and this one I couldn't place. And I've sat with it for a year now, and the closest I've come is that it looked like an adjustment, like watching someone recalibrate to new information. The second thing I can't resolve is that when the tow truck arrived and she got in the cab, the driver made no attempt to do anything to her car. He didn't hitch it up, didn't load it, didn't attach anything, just let her in the cab and drove away, and when I came back to that on-ramp the next morning, her car wasn't there. Tow trucks sometimes send a second truck for the car. That's an explanation. The car might have started on its own and she drove it. That's another explanation. I know there are explanations, and I hold on to them because they are better than the alternative, which is not an explanation but a pattern, the same pattern. Audio cuts out, something wrong on the side of the road, and this time the something wrong came up to my window and talked to me, and the only reason I didn't let it in my car was that I had rules. I made the rules more specific after that. The rule about audio became a warning, not just something to note, but something to act on, and the action was to not stop. Keep driving. Do not stop for anything between the audio cut and the audio returning, and I've followed that rule now for over a year, and there have been 3 occasions on which the audio cut out, and something appeared on the shoulder or in the road before it came back, and all 3 times I kept moving, and I don't know what I avoided, or whether I avoided anything, but I kept moving. The 4th experience happened in January, and it was the quietest of all of them, and in some ways the most disturbing because of how small it was. I was driving home from nowhere in particular. I had gone for a drive because I sometimes do that, because I grew up driving and I find it calming when I can't sleep, which is a habit I've thought about reconsidering. It was about 3 in the morning, and I was on a back road not far from where I live, 5 minutes from my house, and my headlights went out. Not the radio, not the podcast, my headlights, for about 2 seconds. And then they came back, and in those 2 seconds, the sudden darkness outside the car was absolute and complete, and the world contracted to just the instrument panel and my own face reflected back at me in the windshield. And in the reflection of my own face, I could see through the glass to the dark outside, and I could see, at the exact edge of where the headlights weren't yet returned to, a shape at the side of the road that I cannot describe well, because I only had 2 seconds, and the dark was heavy, but it was there. Something that hadn't been there before the lights went out, and wasn't there after they came back. And I know that could be a light adjustment thing, your eyes readjusting after darkness, sometimes sees shapes that aren't there, after images, artifacts, and I know that, and I believe it applies here. Probably. What I can't account for is that when I got home and pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside, I had the distinct and overwhelming sense that I was not alone in the car, that there was something occupying the space in the back seat, and I looked in my rearview mirror and the back seat was empty. Of course it was empty, and I got out of the car and went inside, and I stood in my kitchen for a while with all the lights on before I felt like myself again. I went back out to the car the next morning to get something I'd left in it, and I noticed that the back seat, which I keep generally clean, had a small amount of what looked like road grit or dirt on the rear floor mat, slightly more than there had been before, I thought, though I cannot say with certainty because I don't inventory my floor mats, and it might have been there already, and it might mean nothing, and it probably means nothing. The 5th thing, which happened about 3 months ago and which is the most recent, is the one that made me want to talk about all of this. Not because it was the most frightening, but because of something that happened at the end of it that changed the way I think about everything that came before. I was driving Route 9 again. I know I should probably not drive Route 9 at night, I know that. And I had a good reason. There was a family situation, and I needed to get to my brother's house quickly, and the route around would have added nearly an hour. And I decided to take Route 9 and follow my rules and be fine. And I was fine, mostly. The drive to my brother's was uneventful. I didn't see anything. The radio stayed on, the shoulders were empty, and I arrived and dealt with the family thing, which I won't go into, and I left around midnight and got onto Route 9 heading back, and I was about 15 minutes in, which put me in roughly the same section of road as that first November drive 2 years earlier when the radio cut out. The same silence, the same complete and sudden absence, and my hands went to the same position on the wheel, 10 and 2, tight, and I pressed the accelerator down slightly because the rule was keep moving, and I kept moving. Nothing appeared on the shoulders, no figures, nothing in the road, nothing in my mirrors, just empty highway on both sides, and the radio stayed out for about 3 minutes, and then came back, and I drove the rest of the way home without incident, and when I got home I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes, the way I sometimes do after a difficult drive. And then I checked my phone, the way you do when you've been in the car for an hour checking for messages, and I had a voicemail from an unknown number. Not the same number as the first time, a different number, but local to the Millhaven area code again, and it had come in at the exact time the radio had cut out, which I knew because I had started noting the exact time of each audio cut after the first experience, and I had checked my clock when it happened, so I knew it was 12:47, and the voicemail was from 12:47. I sat in my car in my driveway, and I played the voicemail, and it was 30 seconds of what I can only describe as road noise. the sound of a car interior at highway speed, and at the very end, like the last time, there was something, and this time it was clear enough that I know what it was, even though it has taken me a long time to decide whether to say it, because saying it makes it more real, and I've learned that real things have a weight to them that doesn't go away once you've acknowledged them. What the voice said at the end of the voicemail, very quietly, under the road noise, was my name. My first name, said quietly, said the way you might say someone's name if you knew them, if you had seen them before, if you were letting them know they had been recognized. I called the number back immediately, sitting in my car in my dark driveway with all the doors locked, and it rang 7 times and then connected, not to voicemail, to silence, and I said hello, and the silence went on, and I said hello again, and then the call ended. I don't know who that was. I don't know what it means that someone or something on Route 9 apparently knows my name. I don't know whether it's the same something from 2 years ago or something else entirely, and I don't know what changes based on that distinction. What I know is that I have been driving at night my whole adult life, and I never noticed anything before November 2 years ago, and I cannot tell you with certainty whether the world changed or whether I changed, whether I started seeing something that was always there, or whether my seeing it made it visible, brought it closer, let it learn my name. I drive more carefully now than I used to. I follow my rules. The rules have kept me inside my car and moving forward every time I needed them to, and I tell myself that the rules are what matter, that they are sufficient, that as long as I keep moving and don't stop and pay attention to the patterns, I can drive these roads at night and arrive at where I'm going. What I am less certain about, lying in bed on the nights when sleep takes a long time to come, is whether arriving at where you're going means you've left everything else behind, or whether something that knows your name, something that calls you from a number that doesn't exist, to play you 30 seconds of road noise, and then says your name at the end, whether that something is satisfied by watching you drive through its markers and reach the other side, or whether driving through, passing each figure, completing the sequence, is the beginning of something rather than the end of it. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if want is the right word for whatever it does. But I know the road is still out there, and the figures are still standing somewhere on it in the dark, facing away from something I'm no longer sure is behind them, and somewhere in the static between stations on a long night drive, something is keeping account, marking passage, noting names, and I have been noted, I have been marked, and on the nights when I am driving and I come over a rise and my headlights sweep the road ahead of me, and the shoulders are empty, I am grateful. I am so genuinely and completely grateful for that emptiness, and I keep driving. I always keep driving, and I watch the road and I watch the dark at the edges of the light and I keep moving forward, because stopping is not something I'm willing to do. Not on that road. Not on any road, not anymore. Not since the night the last one turned and I saw it finally facing the same direction I was going.